the Mayan culture, there were the animal heads and the totems and that kind of thing. But it also existed in Egypt with their gods,
right,
with Anubis and the god of the dead. And
right, Horus, the bird-headed god, right.
Right.
Where the animal and the human had a close relationship to one another.
Let's come back to the elements, though.
Okay.
So we're going to go, how did we start? What was the first element there?
Okay. There were 4 grandmothers because, again, Samhain or Halloween was a time where there was an ending, a death cycle. One would honor the young because that's the rebirth, and the very old because that's the death. This is something like our New Year where you see the old person and then the small baby at the New Year's Eve. So this is the agricultural calendar equivalent of the two. So traditionally you honored the very old, celebrating, honoring them, taking them to dinner, inviting them into the home. And the children, in Britain in particular, children went door to door, and they were given sweets and gifts and toys as a way of sweetening the future. The elders or the dead were acknowledged as a way of honoring the past and what supported the people, because again, honoring the past and what supports us is a very important part of most of these earth-centered traditions. Rather than focusing just on the individual and the individual's goals, there's always a sense of interrelationship between peoples in the life-death-life cycle. So there were 4 grandmothers in their tradition, and each grandmother was responsible for a particular element. But you're talking about the elements in alchemy, and I was talking about them more in the Celtic tradition, but it was an interesting connection that we made earlier, because the first grandmother held one of the 4 great treasures. The first treasure was the cauldron of rebirth.
Which would also be the Grail.
Right, the chalice, yes.
The chalice.
It representing pleasure, okay.
And the element of that is water.
Right.
Right.
Right. Or salt in alchemy, yeah. And then the second grandmother held the stone of destiny, which was seen as a manifestation of physical power.
And that's earth.
Yeah.
And
the third grandmother held the spear of the sorcerer or the enchanter, which represented a kind of courage, which I think is connected to the element of fire.
Right.
Okay.
And the lion.
Right.
Right.
And sulfur and alchemy. And then the sword, and so many legends are about the sword and the stone, and the Arthur's sword is the spear, and that represents knowledge, which I think is the element of air, Mercury, the mind. Okay.
And also, in a way, the sword can be correlated lots of times to the cross. It's the same, certainly in the early British transition from Celtic Druidic ideas to Christianity, there was, they brought the 2 things with them, the Grail, which was more of the feminine, and the cross, which was the masculine.
Right.
And the other thing that's interesting about that is that astrologically, we're in the 2,000-year cycle of the age of Pisces, and the symbol that Christ used, of course, was the fish. And the opposite of the sign of Pisces is the Virgin, the Virgo. So there you have, again, the male and the female. Pisces is not generally thought of as being a male sign. It's a water sign, and it's fluid and so on. But anyway, the point is that you have the polarity of the Grail.
It's an interesting point, Mary Michelle, because when you're talking about the opposite being the Virgin, and then we're talking about the Piscean age, which is the Christianity, which again has the patriarchal component built into it, you have to look at the opposite, Virgo, because in Greek mythology, the archetype of Virgo is Demeter, who is the goddess of harvest and the grain, which goes back to the earth-centered religions and the matriarchy again, the honey, the grain, the mead, the connection to the life-death-life cycle, and the Pisces on the other side, a more spiritual component of that transition rather than a physically based component, you see. Because sometimes there's a schism that we see between the physical manifestations of these traditions and then the more spiritually based, and then they get denuded of meaning, they get stripped out of it.
And then also this whole, as we talked about before, this whole male and female element, with the sun
Right, the sun being masculine in some traditions and feminine in others.
Right.
And then shifting to the opposite, the sun being feminine in some traditions, depending on whether or not essentially the culture was matriarchal at the time of the myth. And you can actually determine when the shift is in a tradition by whether or not they were celebrating the sun as male or the sun as female.
And this, of course, of the Native American is quite vast, right? Just in our own country here.
Yeah, well, there's so many tribes. There were over 500 different tribes, and each tribe had a spiritual and cultural tradition that related mostly to the bioregion that they were in, because they were responding to the animals, they were responding to the elements, to the water, to the relationship of the weather, the way they nourished themselves and their people. If it was a hunting-gathering tribe, that there was usually a tradition of warriorship. If it was an agricultural tribe, there was usually a strong tie to the earth. So depending on how they nourished themselves, their relationship to the earth, their relationship to the animals, they would develop a cosmology that would reflect that. Yeah. And each one had a very different cosmological origin. So it's hard to say that there's one across-the-board distillation of Native American tradition.
And it's hard because we all want a very simplistic answer. We want to know, is it going to be, white or black, or is it going to be male or female? Is it going to be, this is one of the problems, I think, with people that have difficulties thinking about the alternative traditions or alternative religions, why there is so much war fought over faith and what people believe. Because we'd like it to be very simple, and it rarely is. When you go back into history, history shows us that you have to be very flexible in your imagination, and you have to take the kind of creative leaps that we're taking here today.
Which goes back to the Halloween conversation that we were having earlier, because Halloween is a great symbol for the transformation of the earth from a living, breathing, life-giving creature, providing seed and food and
But the interesting thing is that all of these traditions, no matter what time of the year, there seems to be certain things that go with them, like the Mardi Gras. There's a mask behind you that is very reminiscent of the Mardi Gras. And that's in February. So that would really be, according to the Celtic calendar, more of a looking to see if spring is in the air.
Right. Or in the Christian calendar, it's St. Bridget's Day. But then again, Bridget in Ireland was one of the names for the great goddess. So it was the incorporation of the pagan goddess fertility celebration, the beginning of the warming of the earth into the Christian iconography. Right. St. Bridget's Day, Mardi Gras, it's about the same time of the year.
But this fertility principle and this life-death cycle, life-death-life cycle, seems to be inherent in most of the traditions and throughout the year. They're just celebrated in a slightly different fashion. Like Easter is Christ rising from the dead, but Christmas is also when he is born. So you have, the life-death-life cycle both at Christmas and at Easter. And I think you also have it in other traditions. I know the Babylonians in Mesopotamia, which is now Iran and Iraq, Inanna, or Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, was also a warrior goddess, and her symbol...
Masculine, so that's the solar female again. I mean, it's the aggressor, the solar female, right?
Right. And I think the Greeks related her to Athena,
right,
the goddess of war and wisdom, and her symbol is the
owl behind me, right, so, over the shoulder, giving knowledge from the hidden worlds, the spiritual worlds.
But I think it's so important for us to contemplate these images and symbols and so on, because it's through the contemplation of it. It isn't necessarily logical thought. It's kind of a taking these leaps of imagination, but I think this is something that more and more people have to do on a regular basis.
Well, this is called in some of the great traditions going from ordinary time into extraordinary time, the contemplation of archetypal images, mythology, different stories, different nature spirits or aspects.
Oh, right. Now let's talk about the wee folk.
Oh, I have some notes about that, because actually I found that at certain times of the year, the we folk were celebrated and acknowledged, again, because the veils are thin. And usually the veils are seen as thin in, let's go back to the Celtic and Druidic calendar, at the midpoints between the solstice and the equinox. And there are 2 times of the year. One is in February, the 1st or the 2nd, which is Candlemas, right? Or St. Bridget's Day. And then
and it has to do with burning of candles, which is a Christian celebration, but it is also based in the idea of fire, which is earth-based.
Right. Or symbolically or alchemically, it's the act of illumination. It's the act of awakening. It's the spirit stirring, or the earth stirring. Or in anthroposophical thought, which is a completely different tack, in their calendars, particularly the people that do that organic farming, which is known as biodynamic farming, they note that in the first week of February, in this latitude-longitude base, there's a discernible shift. And anyone who lives in the same place over 20, 50 years, which is much more unusual now than it was 100 years ago, but one could note with some accuracy when you could feel a discernible shift in the sun from that of again, we're talking about the angles of light warming the earth, or an oblique or oblique influence to something warming and then life-giving. So the symbol of the candle is almost exactly synced up with the time of the year when the sun was actually warm enough to penetrate the frozen earth and then beginning the preliminary work for the planting. Okay? So that's another part of that. But the we folk...
the we folk.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Native American tradition of the we folk and the Celtic tradition.
Well, the Celtic tradition is the... again, it's around Halloween and also in February. The we folk are supposed to be celebrating because they broker influence between the physical and the spiritual worlds. So particularly in England and Ireland and in Scotland and the island cultures, the we folk were very active. They were making mischief. They were the ones who were doing the tricks instead of receiving the treats in that tradition. In Native American culture...
But also in the trees. Right? I mean, the spirit of the tree, the idea I was reading yesterday of knocking on wood, comes from the idea that you're thanking the spirit of the tree.
Right, but that's different than the we folk.
Okay.
Because the we folk, again, broker influence between the earth and human beings. And when you talk about the earth's influence, you incorporate the wind spirits, the water spirits, the fire spirits. It was believed that there were thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of different spiritual influences and presence in most earth-based cultures. So the we folk were the guardians that were mediating between the two, the humans and then the elementals. So a tree spirit like Laurel, Daphne, okay, in Greek mythology, were separate than the we folk. They had their own force, they had their own energy. People honored them in a different way than they would have a relationship with the we folk that were seen as the elves, the fairies, the little ones, the Onagwendawe in the Native American tradition. That was different than the elementals. Okay, the
But the other thing that they had were the angels, of course. Angels were terribly important.
In Celtic. In Celtic tradition,
yeah, you know, and then on into the Christian.
But the elementals and the angels were very connected. They were, Paraciel is the name of one of the angels, elemental angels, and it means of the sky, and different angels having different dominions.
I love that Christian argument of how many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? And they, you know, they talked about this, you know, for hours, which takes great leap of imagination and is certainly not logical, patriarchal kind of thinking, into my way of thinking.
Right.
It's definitely a little out there. How many angels can you fit on the head of a pin?
It's a wonderful thing for children to play with also because their minds are open and receptive, and they seem to intuitively draw to these kinds of ideas and thoughts. Sometimes they think they see angels, fairies.
Hey, me too. They're there, I think. So I want to talk a little bit about the nature of how in the, you know, educational system today, there's a whole trend towards environmental people studying when they go to college, when they don't know what else they particularly are interested in studying, whereas, you know, it used to be humanities. Now it's more about environmental.
Right. I think it was Nikolai Roerich who said that there were, a Russian philosopher and writer, who said that there were three important disciplines in the educational process. The first was science, the second was the arts, and the third was philosophy. And when one studies humanities, if there isn't a strong philosophical component, it's hard to find meaning, you know. So what was seen in the educational system, there's an article just very recently in the New York Times about this also, but what was seen is that it was very hard for people to study humanities and talk about art and beauty and the aesthetic when what was happening in the contemporary culture is that, you know, there's strip mining and the ecology is in crisis and the population is growing in a certain way. So there's a discipline known as depth ecology, which incorporates some of the writings of the transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau.
Which in turn, those guys made a big deal out of May Day.
Right.
Right, and May Day, dancing around the maypole and so on, which was the opposite to Halloween. And I tend to think of May Day as being the in-between time at sunrise, whereas Halloween is the in-between time at sunset.
That's a great point, right. So one can't lose a connection to these times,
right.
And if you spend time in an open and sensitive way and you're following Earth cycles, you're living in one place, you're watching the time of the day, the sunset and the sunrise, intuitively, over a period of time, you're drawn to some kind of a ceremony, some kind of an acknowledgement, whether it's a ritual or not, it's just contextual, but you intuitively are drawn to creating some kind of acknowledgement as years go on, as time goes on, as one matures, that help you reflect and celebrate passages. And that's why these rituals were so important to traditional people. It gave them an opportunity to honor and acknowledge not just the movement of time, but their opportunity to reflect on the movement of time and then their relationship to the earth and the community and
what is time anyway?
Exactly.
It's one of those, in the black hole, you don't even have time. The scientists are now telling us, right? But I want to get back to this environmental thing of the studies and people that are doing these kinds of studies. And my sense is that they are perhaps searching for a new kind of tradition or a new kind of philosophy to validate.
I don't think new. I think that's the Western bias that we need to be careful of, that this is new or it's new improved or it's something fabulous. I think it's a restoration or a reintroduction of something that has existed essentially, simply, without a lot of coercion or manipulation, when people are allowed to observe and to have a healthy relationship with their environment. So these cyclical traditions have much more to do with one's relationship to the environment, their relationship to the earth, their relationship to time, their relationship to their communities, than it has to do with something new. I think it's a reintroduction.
Right, but it's new in the sense of neoclassical or neoplatonic.
Right.
It's taking old ideas, which is what we study. We study the old ideas
and
to be able to
spin them a new way.
Spin them a new way. You know, come up with new ways of looking at it. Because every generation has its own language.
And every generation has to find its own way of making peace with these concepts. I see your point. Yeah, it's very important. Because you can't accept what the elders have said. No way. You have to make up your own.
Well, it's
reinventing hot water.
It's the fight, you know. It's the fight going back to the rivers in the very early traditions, the floods, when they talked about the fact that the earth and water were always fighting each other for that tension that goes on between chaos and order.
Right.
And how important that always is.
And then the great paradox, the higher the order, the greater the chaos that surrounds it.
Right. Well, you know, that's true. Watch politics anywhere in the world, right?
It's true.
Yeah. So, is there something you think we haven't covered that you'd like to mention? I just want to say that Ahs'tiana is someone that is going off to Africa this week to work with a film company. She's going to be working with Michael Douglas and Val Kilmer. She's going to be giving some insight, inspiration, and
hopefully guidance on content and scripts that are being developed by a group of producers down there. And I was reading an article by Russell Means, who's working now in Hollywood. He's a Native American activist who was one of the founders of the American Indian movement. He was talking about his experiences in Hollywood and said, well, it doesn't seem that difficult to bring content in if people are willing to do it. And I see more and more in that industry that there is a willingness or an interest in bringing content, something that's positive or inspiring or uplifting to people.
Well, hopefully you and I can bring more and more content in these kind of discussions.
Yes, I'm looking forward
to that. And I want
to
thank you so much for being here with me today. And I hope that you all have enjoyed this as much as we have. I'm Mary Michelle for WVIP.
Always a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that we're coming up to the time of the winter solstice. And the winter solstice is one of the earlier pagan holidays that existed all over the world, you know, in South America and Central America and Egypt and Ireland and all over Europe, Russia. And the reason being because it was the time that early man could see that it was the shortest day of the year. So one of the things that happened with, you know, newer religions that came afterwards was they honored this idea. Because after all, the earth is something that we have to live with. It's something that is very important to all of us in the way that we connect to each other and communicate with each other. What's one of the first things you say to somebody on the phone? How's the weather down there? You know, everybody wants to know. It's a very easy way to start a conversation, to communicate. It's an important part of our existence. So anyway, the solstice on December 22nd will be the shortest day of the year. And the idea of the solstice is that symbolically it represents the time that the earth is at its lowest point. The earth is freezing. There's a little bit of a fear attached to the idea of things are dying. You know, it's a very, very inward kind of time. It's like when people first go into hibernation. But inherent in that is that it is the beginning of new life, because of course after the winter solstice, directly the next day, the days start to grow longer. So the whole idea is that the light starts coming again, very much like at the summer solstice in July, when it's the beginning of the time of dying. The winter solstice is the time that it's the beginning of new birth. Although we usually have some, you know, fear attached to the idea of having to die to do that. One of the things that I was interested in, too, that I just was looking at yesterday was for children, a present for children that has to do with crystals. And, you know, crystals are formed underneath the earth. This relates very heavily to the sign of Saturn, to the sign of Capricorn, the planet Saturn. They say that Saturn rules crystals. Well, crystals, what are crystals? Crystals are light trapped in salt or water, or I'm not sure of all the physical chemical components that go into it. But I think it's interesting that these are the kind of connections that one makes with in astrological language or in the language of the arts in general, of realizing that light is something that's terribly important, and the beginning of light that happens on the winter solstice, you could say has some correlation to the idea of a crystal. So, what were some of the other things that I was going to talk about today?
Well, before the show, you and I were talking about the whole Jupiter, the satellite, how they launched it into orbit around the planet of Jupiter. What's going on over there?
Right. Well, if you'll remember, a little while back, there was an asteroid that went into the planet Jupiter, too, that was kind of a little bit of a scary thing. No one knew exactly what that meant. One of the things that I've been reading about it recently is that, well, first of all, Jupiter entered the orb of the droid entered the orb of Jupiter Thanksgiving weekend. And I don't know if you all remember, but I was talking that weekend about the fact that there were 7 planets in the sign of Sagittarius. Jupiter rules Sagittarius. So I don't know if the person that launched the droid 6.5 years ago had any idea that it was going to happen at exactly the time that there were 7 planets in Sagittarius. But it's what we call in astrology a synchronistic kind of phenomena, that the enlightenment about Jupiter should come at the time when there are 7 planets in the sign of Sagittarius. Now, also, Sagittarius, as you know probably, is the sign of travel, long-distance travel. It's about higher learning. What is the droid doing? It's traveling very far away, and it's going in and it's observing how the planet Jupiter works. And one of the things about Jupiter that I was reading recently, I can't remember, maybe in the New York Times Magazine section, they were talking about how Jupiter really has been our great protector, because they seem to feel that it might be more gaseous than solid. You know, on the Earth we have Earth underneath our feet. Well, more solid than on Jupiter, let's say. We're not exactly sure how solid it is, but anyway, what Jupiter does, being such a huge planet and having such a strong gravitational pull, is it will pull asteroids or comets or large bodies that might hit other planets in our solar system, the Sun, the Earth, Mercury, Venus, Mars, into its sphere, and it will like eat them, you know. So it really does protect us. Jupiter protects us, and in astrology we call Jupiter the great benevolent planet, and it is protecting us. So anyway, I have to believe that this exploration of Jupiter is going to give us many new ways of looking at our distant horizons and our future. And of course, that's what Jupiter in astrology in the sign of Sagittarius represents. So, you know, I think it's a very exciting time. What it all means, it, you know, may not happen in my lifetime, but it's certainly something to contemplate. And I think you out there, whoever's listening, you know, I mean, I think the idea is to contemplate what it could possibly mean. What does Jupiter represent to you? He was the king of the gods. He was someone that was very fair. He was someone that would give people great wealth, but he would kind of make it a little difficult for them sometimes to learn how to use it, because this is one of the difficulties always with money or too much of anything. You tend to not know how to handle it. But he was someone, his symbols were the horse. He used the horse quite often. He would transform himself into a horse quite often. That correlates again back to this idea of the winter solstice in the Celtic tradition, the Druidic tradition, because they say that the 2 solstices are ruled by 2 different colored horses, a white horse and a dark horse. The dark horse, of course, being at Christmas time, at, you know, the winter solstice, and the light horse being in the summertime. And I think the idea of the horse is that, you know, what does the horse do? It's very swift. It can move from here to there. It pulled Apollo's chariot across the heavens and made the sun rise every day. I'm interconnecting myths here. You know, I'm going from Greek and Roman to Celtic and back and forth. And this is kind of things that I think we should all do with our imagination. It stimulates our imagination to realize that these connections resonate very strongly within us. And we all have these ideas. We all have things that we notice. That isn't it a coincidence that I was thinking about so-and-so and they called, or I was thinking about so-and-so and I had a smell that reminded me of them, or heard a piece of music.
It always seems like this time of year you seem to think of the people that you haven't thought of in a while, or maybe it always seems to me to be that time of the year when I think about someone that I haven't thought about in a while, and it's time to renew old friendships. And it also seems that in terms of the whole solar system, there's so much going on right now.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, and I think these droids going off and looking at other planets, it's really giving us the possibility to stretch our imagination, which I think why the shows like Star Trek and Babylon 5 and all of them are so interesting.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and an exciting show for you today. Boy, I had no idea there was so much going on out there. We'll be right back after these messages. We'll be taking your calls here in the VIP studio. You can call Mary Michelle with your questions at 241-1310. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages.
In just one instance, disaster can strike your home, whether due to fire, flooding, or roof collapse. Any accident that necessitates an evacuation, major repair, or cleanup effort can leave your family on the street with no place to go and no one to turn to. Now introducing Personal Disaster Recovery Service. PDRS dispatches qualified personnel anytime, day or night, to assist with temporary lodging and a cash advance of up to $500. PDRS will dispatch a contractor to board